The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 6 months after Jonas Wakefield had stopped expecting anything from the world except work and silence. It was addressed to his dead brother. Most of the mail that still came to the ranch was addressed to his dead brother. Seed catalogs, equipment invoices, a bill from the general store in Copper Hill that Emmett had never gotten around to paying. Jonas paid them all without complaint, the same way he fed Emmett's horses and mended Emmett's fences and slept in the spare room of Emmett's house because the master bedroom still smelled like his brother's pipe tobacco, and Jonas couldn't bring himself to open the windows. But this letter was different. This letter was from a woman named Catherine Avery, and it began with the words, "Dear Mr. Wakefield, I am writing to accept your generous offer of marriage." Jonas read it 3 times, standing in the kitchen with his coffee going cold, while the morning light crawled across the floor and the clock on the mantel ticked off seconds he couldn't get back. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago, posted from a town called Millfield in eastern Ohio. It was written in a careful, educated hand on paper so thin he could see the shadow of his own fingers through it. Catherine Avery was a widow with 2 children, a boy of 7 named Isaac and a girl of 4 named Nell, and she was writing to confirm that she would arrive in Copper Hill on the afternoon stage on May the 14th. May the 14th was tomorrow. Jonas set down the letter and pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table, as if the solid wood could anchor him to a reality that had just tilted sideways. Emmett had sent for a mail-order bride. Emmett, who'd been dead for 6 months. Emmett, who'd been thrown from a horse on a cold November morning and had broken his neck on a rock that Jonas had been meaning to clear from the north pasture for 2 years and never had. Emmett, whose last words had been about the weather, because Emmett Wakefield talked about the weather the way other men talked about God, with conviction, with passion, and with the absolute certainty that it mattered more than anything else in the world. And now a woman and 2 children were arriving tomorrow, expecting to find a husband, and instead they were going to find Jonas. Jonas, who was not Emmett. Jonas, who was 5 years older and 50 years more tired, and had none of his brother's easy charm or quick laughter or talent for making strangers feel like friends. Jonas, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to a woman in the 6 months since Emmett died, because he didn't know what to say to people who weren't his brother. He should write to her, tell her the truth, that Emmett was dead, that the marriage was off, that she should stay in Ohio where she had a life and a history, and presumably people who cared about her. It was the decent thing to do, the honest thing. Jonas was nothing if not honest. It was the quality people most often mentioned when they described him, usually in the same sentence as difficult and not much for conversation. But the letter had taken 3 weeks to arrive, and Catherine Avery was already on a stage somewhere between Ohio and Montana, and there was no way to reach her before she stepped off that coach tomorrow afternoon, expecting a life that no longer existed. Jonas sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he got up, put on his hat, and went outside to work, because that was the only thing he knew how to do when the world stopped making sense. He was standing outside the general store the next afternoon, covered in fence post dust, looking exactly like what he was, a rancher who'd been putting off a reckoning with reality, when the stage pulled into Copper Hill. The coach door opened, and Catherine Avery stepped out. She was not what Jonas had expected, though he realized immediately that he hadn't known what to expect, since Emmett's letter to her, wherever it was, had presumably described Emmett, not Jonas, and Jonas had no idea what kind of woman his brother had been trying to attract. She was small and dark-haired, with a face that looked like it had been designed for smiling, but had recently forgotten how. She wore a gray traveling dress that had seen better days, and carried a carpet bag in one hand, while the other gripped the shoulder of a boy who was clearly trying very hard to look brave and not quite managing it. Behind them, a little girl with enormous brown eyes peered out from the coach door with the cautious expression of a child who'd learned that new places weren't always kind. Catherine's eyes found Jonas immediately. He was the only man standing alone outside the store, which probably made the identification simple, and he watched her face cycle through a rapid series of expressions: hope, confusion, uncertainty, and finally the careful blankness of a woman who'd been disappointed before and was bracing for it again. "Mr. Wakefield?" she asked. Jonas removed his hat. "Ma'am, I'm Jonas Wakefield. I'm Emmett's brother." He paused, and the pause contained everything he should have said in a letter 3 weeks ago. "Emmett is dead. He died 6 months ago. I'm sorry you weren't told." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Catherine's face didn't change. She'd clearly had practice absorbing blows without showing it, but her hand tightened on Isaac's shoulder hard enough to make the boy wince. "Dead," she repeated. The word had no inflection. It was just a sound, a fact being tested for weight. A riding accident. He was thrown from his horse. It was quick. Jonas didn't know if that last part was true, but people always said it, and he supposed it was kinder than the alternative. Catherine stood very still on the boardwalk while the life she'd been traveling toward collapsed around her. Jonas watched her eyes go to Isaac, then to Nell, still peering from the coach door, then back to Jonas. He could see her doing the arithmetic. No husband, no home, no money to get back to Ohio. 2 children who needed feeding and sheltering, and a future that had just been pulled out from under them like a rug. "I see," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that told Jonas she'd had practice keeping it that way. "Well, I suppose we'll need to find lodging for the night. Is there a boarding house in town?" "There is, but you don't need it." The words came out before Jonas had fully decided to say them, which was unusual for a man who weighed every sentence like he was paying for it by the word. "Emmett's ranch is 4 miles north. The house is empty except for me, and it's got 3 bedrooms. You and the children can stay there while we figure out what comes next." Catherine studied him with eyes that were dark and careful and missed nothing. "Mr. Wakefield, I don't know you." "No, ma'am, you don't, but you knew my brother, at least through his letters, and I'm offering you a roof and meals and time to make a plan. No obligations, no expectations. Just help, because you need it and I'm able to give it." Isaac tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry," he whispered. loud enough for Jonas to hear. The boy's face was thin in a way that suggested hunger wasn't new to him, and Jonas felt something twist in his gut. Not pity exactly, but something harder and more personal. He knew what it felt like to be a child who was hungry and trying not to show it. Catherine looked down at her son, then at her daughter, then at Jonas. Whatever calculation she was running behind those dark eyes, it came up with an answer she didn't love but could live with. "One night," she said. "We'll stay one night, and then we'll discuss arrangements." "Yes, ma'am." The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes, mostly in silence. Isaac sat in the wagon bed watching the landscape with wide eyes. Nell fell asleep in Catherine's lap within 10 minutes. Catherine held her daughter and stared straight ahead with the set jaw of someone enduring. Jonas wanted to tell her about the ranch, about the life Emmett had been building. He wanted to explain that he'd kept everything running, that he'd read Emmett's letters and knew what his brother had promised. But Jonas Wakefield was not a man who said things like that. He was a man who said, "The well's out back, and supper's at 6, and let his actions speak." The house made a better impression than Jonas did. Catherine's eyes widened as the wagon crested the hill and the ranch spread out below them. The sturdy house with its wide porch, the barn painted red, the corrals and outbuildings, the creek running silver through the bottom of the valley. It was beautiful in the way that only land that had been loved and worked could be. And Jonas saw Catherine's careful composure crack just slightly as she took it in. "Emmett built this?" she asked. "He started it. Our father left us the land. Emmett built the house and the barn. I've kept it up since." Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop and came around to help Catherine down. Nell was still asleep, and Jonas reached for her without thinking, lifting the girl from Catherine's arms and settling her against his shoulder with a gentleness that surprised them both. Catherine watched him carry her daughter up the porch steps, and something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the absence of distrust, which was its own kind of beginning. Inside, the house was clean. Jonas had spent the morning scrubbing it with the desperate energy of a man who didn't know what else to do. And warm from the stove he'd left burning. He showed Catherine the bedrooms, the kitchen, the pantry he'd stocked with provisions from town. He laid Nell on the bed in the largest room and covered her with a quilt his mother had made. And when he turned around, Isaac was standing in the doorway, staring at him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Are you going to marry my mama?" the boy asked. Jonas looked at the boy, 7 years old, thin, serious, carrying the weight of being the man of a family that had no man. "That's not something I've been asked to do," he said carefully. "Good," Isaac said, "because the last man who wanted to marry Mama hit her, and if you hit her, I'll kill you." The words were delivered with the flat sincerity of a child who meant exactly what he said, and Jonas felt something rearrange itself inside his chest. Not shock. He'd suspected something like this from the bruised quality in Catherine's eyes, but a cold, clear anger that settled into his bones and stayed there. "Nobody is going to hit your mama," Jonas said. "Not while I'm alive. You have my word on that, Isaac." The boy studied him for a long moment, measuring the promise against whatever experience had taught him about promises and the men who made them. Then he nodded once, a curt, adult gesture that no 7-year-old should have mastered, and went to find the kitchen. The first night became the first week through a process so gradual that Jonas couldn't identify the exact moment when one night stopped being mentioned. Catherine cooked meals that were so much better than Jonas's own miserable attempts that he found himself looking forward to supper for the first time in years. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been properly cleaned since Jonas's mother died. She organized the pantry, mended curtains, planted herbs by the back door, small domestic acts that transformed the house from a place where a man slept into a place where people lived. Jonas kept his distance. He slept in the spare room, took his meals quickly, spent his days working the ranch with the same dogged persistence he'd brought to everything since Emmett's death. He spoke to Catherine about practical matters. The water pump needed priming in the morning. The henhouse door stuck. There was a rattlesnake den near the south fence that the children should avoid, and nothing else. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't tell her about his. They existed in the same house like two planets in adjacent orbits, close enough to feel each other's gravity, but never touching. It was Nell who collapsed the distance. The little girl had been silent since their arrival, not shy exactly, but watchful in the way of children who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. She followed Catherine everywhere, one hand always gripping her mother's skirt, her enormous brown eyes tracking every adult in every room as if she were cataloging exits. On the 5th morning, Jonas was sitting on the porch repairing a bridle when Nell appeared beside him. She didn't speak. She just stood there, watching his hands work the leather with the focused intensity of a scientist observing an experiment. After 10 minutes, she sat down on the porch boards next to his chair. After 20, she leaned against his leg. After 30, she was asleep, her small body curled against his boot like a cat that had found a patch of sun. Jonas sat perfectly still for an hour, afraid to move, afraid to breathe wrong, afraid of the fierce tenderness that was flooding his chest and making it hard to swallow. When Catherine came looking for Nell and found her asleep against the man she barely knew, she stopped in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes bright with something Jonas couldn't name. "She doesn't do that," Catherine whispered. "She doesn't go to anyone, not since—" She stopped. "She doesn't go to anyone." Jonas looked down at the sleeping child and then up at Catherine, and for the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than grief and guilt and the dull, grinding weight of keeping a dead man's ranch alive. "I was going to tell you something," Jonas said quietly, "about Emmett's letters. I found them after he died, all the ones you wrote to him, and drafts of the ones he wrote to you. I read them." He paused, knowing how that sounded. "I read them because I missed him, and his letters were the only place he was still alive." Catherine sat down slowly in the other porch chair. "What did they say?" "He told you about the ranch, about the cattle and the garden and the view from the kitchen window at sunset. He told you he was lonely and that he wanted someone to share this life with." Jonas stared at his hands. "But the thing he wrote about most was me." Catherine's brow furrowed. You? He worried about me, said I was alone too much, that I'd shut myself off from people after our parents died, that I worked too hard and talked too little, and was going to end up a bitter old man if someone didn't shake me loose. Jonas almost smiled. His words. He said he was bringing you here partly for himself, and partly because he thought I needed a family around me, even if I was too stubborn to admit it. Catherine was quiet for a long time. On the ground beside Jonas's chair, Nell shifted in her sleep and grabbed hold of his bootlace. He sounds like he was a good man, Catherine said. He was the best man I ever knew. And you kept his ranch running, fed his horses, paid his bills, answered the door when his mail-order bride showed up on his porch. She paused. You could have sent us away, Jonas. You had every right and every reason. No. The word came out harder than he intended. I didn't have any reason. Emmett wanted you here. He wanted someone in this house who'd bring it back to life. And whether he's alive or not, he was right. This place was dying. I was dying. He stopped, shocked by his own honesty. Jonas Wakefield did not say things like this. Jonas Wakefield said, the well's out back, and supper's at 6. But Nell was asleep against his boot, and Catherine was looking at him with eyes that had stopped being careful and started being kind, and the words kept coming like water through a broken dam. Stay, he said, not for one night or 1 week. Stay because this house needs you, and those children need a home, and he faltered. I need to stop being the man Emmett was afraid I'd become. Catherine reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. Her fingers were small and rough from work, and warm in a way that made Jonas realize how cold he'd been. I came here to marry a stranger, she said. I suppose the stranger just turned out to be a different one than I expected. I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet. I'm asking you to stay and let us figure this out together, whatever it turns out to be. What if it turns out to be something good? Jonas looked at her, this small, careful, brave woman who'd traveled 1,000 miles to start over and had found the ground shifted under her feet before she'd even unpacked, and felt the last lock on the last door inside him turn. Then I'll try not to ruin it, he said. But I should warn you, I'm not easy. I'm quiet and I'm stubborn, and I don't always say what I'm feeling because half the time I don't know what I'm feeling until it's already happened. Emmett mentioned that in his letters. I'll bet he did. Catherine smiled. It was small and cautious and not yet sure of itself. But it was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it changed her entire face, lit it up from the inside like a lantern being turned on in a dark room. From the yard, Isaac's voice carried up to the porch. He'd found the barn cats and was attempting to count them, a task made impossible by the fact that barn cats recognized no authority and held still for no one. His frustrated commentary drifted through the afternoon air, and Jonas felt something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten the word for it. Home. The house had been a house for 6 months, walls and roof and empty rooms. But in the space of 5 days, with a woman's herbs by the back door, and a boy's boots on the porch, and a little girl asleep against his leg, it had become something else. something Emmett had wanted, and Jonas had needed, and none of them had planned. They stayed. Catherine moved into the master bedroom after Jonas insisted, and he remained in the spare room without complaint. Isaac began following Jonas to the barn each morning, asking questions about horses and cattle and fencing, with the relentless curiosity of a boy who'd been starving for this kind of knowledge. Nell stopped gripping her mother's skirt and started gripping Jonas's trouser leg instead, toddling after him with a devotion that made the ranch hands grin and Jonas's ears turn red. Summer turned to fall. Jonas taught Isaac to ride. Catherine transformed the garden into something that produced enough to fill the pantry for winter. Nell spoke her first full sentence since arriving. "Jonas, up please." And Jonas picked her up and held her against his chest and turned away so nobody would see his face. They were married in October, on a cool morning when the aspens were turning gold, and the valley looked like something painted by someone who believed the world was beautiful. The preacher came from Copper Hill, and Hector stood as witness, and Isaac held Nell's hand to keep her from trying to climb Jonas's leg during the ceremony. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Jonas looked at Catherine with the terrified expression of a man who'd been brave about everything in his life except this. She laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and kissed him herself, standing on her toes to reach, her hands on either side of his face. That night, Jonas sat on the porch and looked out at the valley and thought about his brother. Emmett, who'd sent for a woman and 2 children because he was lonely. Emmett, who'd written in his letters that Jonas needed a family, even if Jonas didn't know it. Emmett, who died on a November morning and left behind a ranch and a dream, and a brother who didn't know how to live without him. You were right, Jonas thought, about all of it. Inside, Catherine was reading to the children by lamplight. Isaac's serious voice asked a question, and Catherine laughed, and Nell said something that was probably Jonas, because she said it approximately 400 times a day. The sounds drifted through the open door and settled around him like a blanket. Emmett Wakefield had sent for a family. They'd just arrived 6 months late, and they'd found the wrong brother waiting. Turned out he was the right one after all.